I'm Luke Story. For the past 22 years, I've been relentlessly committed to my deepest passion, designing the ultimate lifestyle based on the most powerful principles of spirituality, health, psychology, and personal development. The Lifestylist Podcast is a show dedicated to sharing my discoveries and the experts behind them with you. Mark, here we go.
Here we go. Luke, it's good to be here, man.
We're about to head down a massive and deep rabbit hole, my friend.
Well, here we go. Long time coming. I'm looking forward.
I'm so excited for this conversation.
Yeah, me too.
So I want to start by asking you right off the bat, who are three teachers or teachings that have profoundly impacted your life and your work?
Beautiful. So one would be Isaac Luria. Isaac Luria is this unimaginably brilliant and beautiful interior scientist. And I try and stay away from words like mystic because they connote things that are unclear. Interior scientist means we go into interiors, we do experiments, we validate the results of those experiments, and we establish something about the nature of the interior face of the cosmos. So I call him not a mystic, as he's usually called. He's an interior scientist. And he's in the 16th century, and there's an entire subtle literature, not easily available, on how Luria actually shaped the Renaissance. In other words, there were these very important mystery schools prior to the Renaissance, from which Hebrew wisdom, particularly Kabbalah, esoteric wisdom, but better said interior sciences, then went into Christian Kabbalah, Christian interior sciences, if you will, and then essentially formed the mystery schools that informed the entire Renaissance and all of Western civilization.
Wow.
So Luria is a very, very important hidden figure. And in general, it's a different conversation. Mystery schools are important. We had in the West the Eleusinian mysteries. There are, of course, Eastern mystery schools. There are Asian mystery schools. There are, African mystery schools. Mystery schools are very important. So that would be one figure.
Cool.
Right? A second figure who is, unimaginably important to me was Kierkegaard. Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, who talks about the relationship or the experience, let me say it differently, the experience of trust, right? How I live in trust. And he makes a number of very important distinctions between faith and trust. I think those distinctions are actually in many ways wrong, but a deep engagement with him was formative to me, for which I am, eternally grateful. And a third figure who I'm kind of deeply in love with would be Blake, William Blake, right, who is an enormously, an epic figure. And Blake is drawing, on Luria. And maybe if I can just throw in a fourth source, which would be a group of people, not one person. And in general, we ascribe too much value to one person. There are groups of people. I'm about to put out a series of volumes at our think tank, and we have like 5-6 vectors of work. Each one is a group of volumes, but the central set of volumes is going to be published by David J. Temple. And David J. Temple, we joke about him. We met him in Oxford once, right? He called, but he's actually a created personality, and he represents myself and Zach Stein, right? And other interlocutors. But basically, we realized that. Who wrote the Vedas? Well, we don't quite know. Who wrote the Bible? Well, not quite clear, is it? Right? Who wrote the Zohar, which is the major work of, medieval Hebrew sciences? Not quite clear, but about 10 people. And so we have this very win-lose metrics Western notion of the author, and the author is important, and unique self is important as central to my thinking. And yet there's also unique self symphonies. Right? And so there was a particular unique self symphony of characters, 3, 8, or 10 is not clear, who wrote this work called the Zohar, a 3-volume work called, the Work of Radiance, which is a very subtle, sophisticated, unimaginably beautiful Aramaic text. Was a formative text in my life, where I still kind of live inside of, and that was the text which really defined Luria and then the Renaissance afterwards. It's one of those hidden esoteric texts of Western civilization. So that's a little bit of a
Cool.
There's lots of other ways to go, but
our show notes writer's going to be busy.
right.
Well, it's funny. It's funny how you mentioned though the conglomerate of authorship, right, and creation. And what came to mind is we were just talking about the magic of music earlier before we recorded, and right when you said that, I thought of, think of the Beatles, right, the archetype of just the ultimate supergroup, and each individual part of that group as a person had their own unique expression, their own body of talent, but put them together, and now you have this other entity, right?
And that's what music is, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's a commitment to the music. They asked Mick Jagger, once, who was actually, was an old acquaintance of my partner, KK. So they asked Mick, like, how did the Stones make it? And he said, we had so many conflicts and so much went wrong, but we had a vision of this horizon called the Stones that we were all in devotion to. And it's actually a great answer. In other words, at the think tank, as we're trying to write this new story of value in response to the meta crisis, what we realized was we have to go larger than the win-lose metrics in which we are cultural critics or public intellectuals or spiritual teachers, but basically we're in a win-lose metrics game, trying to get a big book out, doing a series of tours. It's basically we're commodifying spirit, and we're basically, and there's so much is like that, right, on this.
Yeah.
So we said we have to liberate ourselves from that and find this, and if I can use a word that we don't use often, we're almost embarrassed by it, but kind of purity, devotion, sincerity, right? Those words that, we use them as booby prizes, right? Oh, she's not very talented, but she's very devoted.
Right.
He's not very smart, but he's very sincere.
The word purity, though, to me, I mean, I see the puritanical, pious kind of the one definition of it, but when I hear that word, what I hear is integrity.
Right?
Yeah, I like that word.
Isn't it a beautiful word?
Yeah.
Yeah, purity.
I love words.
Words are so gorgeous. That would take us down, but purity is so that's why we came up with David J. Temple, and David J. Temple. And so he's actually putting out his first book in 2-3 months on value, and maybe when that comes out, we'll talk again. We're wildly excited about it, and to try and put a new great library into culture that can actually evolve the source code of consciousness and culture in response to this meta crisis. So that's all by way of saying hello. Hi.
That's great.
It's so great to be here.
I often ask that question at the end of a podcast. Give us 3 teachers, 3 takeaways. Like, in other words, so you have this body of knowledge and wisdom, said guest, and where'd you get it? But for some reason, I wanted to start with that.
Yeah,
because I knew you'd have a really interesting answer. How would you define enlightenment? From where you are in your work and perspective right now?
It's a great question. And this is actually quite clear, right? I think enlightenment actually can only mean one thing, right? Enlightenment is sanity. That's what enlightenment is. It's that simple.
Wow, I like that.
Right? Enlightenment, and actually any other understanding of enlightenment has to come back to this. That's what insanity means. I know the nature of reality. I know who I am. So, for example, let me just give a simple example. If I say, hey, I'm Luke. No, you're not Luke. No, I'm Luke. You're Mark. So that might be slightly funny in the first second or not, right? But if I keep at it, it's like 15 minutes. And you say, wow, this is a little scary. I heard he was controversial, but didn't know he was insane, right? Right? And I was like, I don't know who I am, right? But here's the strange thing. The difference between Luke and Mark, roughly the same age. Luke's a little better looking, but basically 2 guys, roughly, some distinctions. We each have uniqueness is very important, but there's some overlap. But if I think I'm Luke, I'm insane. Because I don't know who I am. But the gap between thinking I'm a separate self and actually knowing my true nature, right, as what I call unique self, the unique expression of the field of consciousness and desire, and actually knowing that entire field actually lives in me, and I'm a discrete and irreducible unique expression of that field, the difference between that and thinking that I'm a separate self is a far wider gulf than the mistake of Luke and Mark. Now, of course, KK and Allison might be quite upset about us making that mistake, right? But the rest of the world could deal with it.
Well, yeah.
So enlightenment is sanity.
Right.
Knowing my true nature.
That reminds me of there's two different ways you could frame the statement, I am God, right? One could be messianic insanity, and one could be the factual truth that in the field of consciousness, I and you are but one expression of God,
Right.
right? But we're not separate from, we're a part of just one little unique thread in the tapestry.
Yes.
But it depends on the framing, right?
Right. No, that's very beautiful. And just let's emphasize that word unique, which is a whole other conversation. But I am God doesn't mean that I'm absorbed into the divine and I'm therefore lost. It means I'm inseparable from the larger field of consciousness and desire, and then as you say, but I'm an irreducibly unique expression of that love intelligence and that love beauty and that love desire. So I'm not true self. That's the great mistake of the traditions. It's virtually all Enlightenment traditions are flawed. They fail because they claim that enlightenment is the move from separate self to true self. I'm separate. Now I realize I'm part of the one. That's only the first step. And if you stay there, you actually remain insane. Right? Right? And that's really, really important. Virtually every enlightened tradition makes that mistake. So can we play with this for a second? Is that okay?
I love it.
Okay, so let's say separate self is a puzzle piece looking for the puzzle who's told there is no puzzle. So first off, it's hard to walk as a puzzle piece. Have you ever tried that? Right? It doesn't work. And you're told there's no puzzle, so it's completely pathologizing. It's crazy making. True self is the realization, no, I'm not a separate puzzle piece. There's just the puzzle, the one. That's true self. But that's equally insane making because you look at the puzzle and you see, oh, but there's these lines separating the puzzle pieces. Then you say to your teacher, but what about these separate lines? And your teacher says, sit on the cushion, die on the cushion, illusion, right? In other words, this huge tradition, both in West and East, both esotericism, which say that's an illusion, but you know that's not true. Because actually, I'm Luke. That separateness is not a delusion in the mind of God. And so, no, then you've got to get to no. Unique self is a puzzle piece that fits perfectly into the puzzle. A puzzle piece that perfectly fits into the puzzle. So I'm a unique self, I'm a puzzle piece, and I fit perfectly, and I actually complete the puzzle perfectly. And no other piece other than my piece can complete this puzzle. That's unique self. So I'm the irreducible unique expression of the field of true self. So now I'm getting to enlightenment. But then that's not enough because enlightenment doesn't include evolution. And this, again, this is so critical. This is why I said to my friend Michael Murphy, he has a little place called Esalen on the West Coast, I said, Michael, you're not impacting, right, the mainstream because you're basically teaching uneven bullshit, right? You have anyone teaches it's all, no one captures the flag, it's all uneven. And the enlightenment you're teaching is completely against the intuitions of Western civilization that actually my uniqueness counts. And there's no evolution in it. So the fourth level of self is evolutionary unique self. So I'm a puzzle piece that not only completes the puzzle, I'm a puzzle piece that evolves the puzzle. So in other words, so Luke's story and the story of Luke's story, if you will, right? That story is not just a story you're supposed to move beyond. That story is chapter and verse in the universal love story. It's chapter and verse in God's sacred autobiography. The irreducible uniqueness of Luke's story, not his separateness. So notice we're making a fundamental ontological distinction, which is lost in the traditions. They all get this wrong. They conflate separateness and uniqueness. Huge mistake. Separateness is not uniqueness. Right? So I move beyond my separateness. I'm one with the field. Then I'm an irreducibly unique expression of the field. The field is seamless, but it's not featureless. And its irreducibly unique feature is Luke, who is, and this is the most shocking idea in the interior sciences, Luke is more God to come. In other words, Luke's not just, I am God. Luke is more God than there was before Luke. Right? So he's not just, he's part of God. No, actually, divinity experiences a shocking self-recognition looking at Luke that wasn't available to divinity before. Right? And we want to make that kind of very just available.
Beautiful. So good.
It's stunning. And if you make this available to your listeners, you could say it this way. I was just talking to our mutual friend, Aubrey. So I had a certain experience talking to Aubrey. I walked in and I saw you from a distance. I remembered just, our meetings, and like something opened in me and some other part of me, I could actually feel it. Oh, Luke. So Luke evoked in me a part of me that Aubrey didn't. And hopefully Mark will evoke something in Luke that Jack didn't. So it's precisely how it works. That's the anthropological method, meaning whatever's happening in reality happens in us. So Luke evokes in divinity a dimension of divinity that no other being that ever was, is, or will be can evoke. That's actually a shocking realization. But once you get it, it's actually obvious. Like, all great. And in that sense, if Luke isn't clarified, if he's not living Luke's unique self, there's quite literally less divinity in the world. You could throw out the Prozac for at least a little while, right? Right? I mean, it's just stunning.
That also fits in. It's funny the way you approach things is so much more intellectual and academic. So I translate things, as you're saying, into more simplistic, broad strokes, which is fun. Because you're the unique expression of you as God and me as me. But in thinking about the way I view solving human dilemmas, is by the elevation or evolution of consciousness, right? And it takes the futility out of it and actually makes it interesting to me, because I know that the only way that I can contribute to the field is by doing whatever I can to contribute to my own expression of the field, right?
Beautiful.
So it's like, but the way you phrased it, there's now more divinity because I'm expressing that. And imagine if a world in which more people were expressing sanity, enlightenment.
Enlightenment is sanity.
Right? And the inertia of more awakened souls and human bodies, it's like the rising tide raises all boats kind of thing.
Gorgeous.
It's beautiful.
And I'm going to be, with permission,
Yeah. You always have permission too.
Thank you. So this might
jump in.
This next sentence might get me uninvited to any future podcast, but I'm gonna do it anyways, because what the hell, right? Which is nothing you said was simplistic. So you said I'm going to be simplistic. No, it wasn't simple. It was clear. So I want to disambiguate simple and clear. And what you were doing was not simplistic. It was actually what I would call it's what I call anthro-ontology. Anthro, human, ontology, it's for real, meaning I can the mysteries are within, and I can locate it. I can say it in terms of what I call second simplicity. Take a lot of complexity, and I think one of your gifts is, and I hopefully we share that, is the second simplicity. So that's one. But that matters, not simplistic, second simplicity. Two is, this is the slightly bigger pushback, right? Which is actually nothing I said was either intellectual or academic, right? And so I want to just kind of, right? Academic implies a kind of, rarefied discipline in the ivory tower that is kind of, jargon laden and kind of, siloed in particular disciplines and not connected to a broader picture. So I'm going to throw that word out entirely. And intellectual, suggests that it lives in the mind, and it kind of divorces the mind from the belly, right? And from the soma and from the feeling tone. And so I've never in my life, Luke, brother, right? And I've never thought of a good idea ever. Literally, without hyperbole, I've always felt an idea. Like you feel it. You feel it just kind of like, right? It's in your gut and it just stays in. And then I look for words to spell feelings. I look for words to spell desires. Magic is the spell of desire in words. So words are magical. We talked about words. We almost went down the word rabbit hole, but words are magical. And in order to create a new story of value that's not new agey, that's not human potential movement lost in its own declarations, that's not fundamentalist regressive, we need to actually create a new field of language, which is potent because it's precise, because words mean something. We use them carefully. And we haven't managed to create that level of gravitas in culture, right? We have just an enormous amount of uneven superficiality with some gems of wisdom, right? Like yourself. But we need now to create a field of language which doesn't become a a homogenizing story, but we need a kind of what I would call a universal grammar of value, a global story as a context for our diversity. And if we don't get that, I'm fairly convinced, and I have been for the last decade or so. We mentioned my friend Daniel. Daniel and I have been talking about this for a decade. I'm fairly convinced that the meta crisis will result in one of several possible dystopias. None of them which are looking good. And meta crisis is not our topic, so we won't go there, but it's real. The meta crisis is real. And the response to this meta crisis of kind of existential risk, the death of humanity, or what I call the second form of existential risk, the death of our humanity, right? Upgraded algorithms, downgraded human beings, right? And that whole story. So the response to that, there's lots of work on infrastructure. And our friend Daniel is doing a lot of work on infrastructure, which is really important. How do you detect bioweapons and wastewater? Infrastructure. Social structure, second possibility. How do you regulate AI research? How do you create social bodies? So there's infrastructure and social structure, Marvin Harris's distinction. And I think they're both important. I don't think either of us will take us home, although we need to do that. But there's a third category, which superstructure. Superstructure is the story I live inside of. And I'm convinced, brother, right, based on lots of information that I won't bore you with now, that the only way to respond to the meta crisis, the only thing that actually evolves the story of history is a new story. Not a fanciful story, not a conjectured story, but a story that integrates the validated insights of pre-modern, modern, and postmodern into a new story of value rooted in first values and first principles. And in that, we need to be precise in our language. And in that sense, science needs to inform us. Science and poetry need to come together. Language needs to evoke, to invoke, to be poetic, but it also needs to be precise, no less than scientific language. The interior sciences need to be precise. So I apologize. That was a long, tender, honoring play with the word intellectual and academic.
No,
Yeah.
I appreciate the distinction.
Yeah, total.
And you're talking to someone who loves language. I love listening to podcasts, recording podcasts, having conversations. I like foreign languages, although I'm only decent at one other one. Spanish. I got a little Spanish down. Okay. But I love words because of the power that they pack, especially words that are rooted in fundamental principles.
Right.
And I think I got this. And this is something I was flirting with the idea of going into this, but I didn't know if you had any experience or understanding of it. But when I came to really understand the power in words and what they represent was through many years of devotion to the 12 steps and adopting those into my life. First out of just desperation and self-preservation, but then
always a good place to start.
Then digging underneath and going, wow, you can take one word like surrender, acceptance, willingness, open-mindedness, humility, amends, like all those they're now to me like, well, yeah, duh, that's how you live your life, right? But for someone who had no moral compass and wasn't instilled with any sense of morality or value. As you say, finding those words and teasing them apart and digging into the root of those words and building a relationship with the energy that they represent.
It's gorgeous.
There have been signposts that have guided me. Turn left, turn right. Oop, don't turn that way. You're falling out of truth. You're falling out of integrity, right? So those words led me into all sorts of other words. So when I say like academic or intellectual, I like that.
Yeah.
It's just the way that, like, if I get into some dense content, it's the way that I can integrate it and digest it is by teasing it apart and finding a relationship to my heart with that. Like what's the language of the heart, right? Like how do I imbue it with feeling?
Gorgeous.
Back to enlightenment.
Yeah.
As we all have, but I'll just speak subjectively. There was a lot of suffering in the first half of my life. And so when I started to seek God, I started to follow different spiritual teachings and teachers and put this prize on self-realization or enlightenment. And my early understanding of it was just not just sanity, but the end of suffering. Like if it's like a destination, if I can get to this point where I have less close relationship with ego, with the destructive parts of the intellect, then I'll be free and I won't have any problems, you know? So it's like chasing the carrot of
Right.
enlightenment.
How did that work for you?
Well, not very well.
Right.
But I think, and this I want to dig
Yeah,
more
no, this is
out,
great.
but I think there is some truth based on your framing of it as just fundamental sanity, right? And going back to the puzzle and all of that, but is not less suffering in your experience inherent through the experience of more sanity?
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely.
The more sane one is, the less one suffers. So it's like, even
Right.
though maybe the goal isn't to evade the human experience of suffering and being
Yeah, no,
embodied,
totally.
but as I become more sane, meaning for me, more aligned with truth, with fundamental universal truth, then
Yeah.
there's less inherent suffering because I have a more broad contextualization of what we're fucking doing here.
Yeah.
And so water does tend to roll off the duck's back a bit easier when you're wearing the world like a loose garment.
No, you got a better context for the duck.
Right. And
Right.
things are just less serious, you know. So I
Yeah.
don't know if I'm enlightened, but I'm certainly more enlightened than I was a year ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago. It
Yeah.
seems to be I'm becoming more sane.
There's no, very beautiful. So let's take a couple of steps here. First, let's just talk. You talked about two things. Let's talk for a second about words, and then we go to enlightenment.
Okay,
Because words are so
perfect.
beautiful.
I love how you can track all my
No, so it's that's such a beautiful.
randomness.
The word is so great. So abracadabra, magic. So abracadabra is actually two Aramaic words. Avracadabra. I create through the word. It's very beautiful. I create through the word. So that it's the creativity of the word. And the word itself, the word in Hebrew, the word for word in Hebrew is davar, D-A-V-A-R, which means both thing and word. Meaning there's meaning or value or aliveness or logos or the word or information, if you want to use that. So information, meaning, value, the word, logos, let's use those as a cluster of words that go all the way down, meaning the thing isn't only an inanimate thing. In the word in Hebrew, davar, D-A-V-A-R, you have both thing and word, meaning the thing is alive, right? It's self-actualizing, it's self-organizing. And so we start the first nanoseconds of the Big Bang, and we've got these three quarks which kind of come together. And from these three quarks, we get Beethoven, right? We go from dirt to Shakespeare. We go from, mud to Mozart. We go from, bacteria to Bach. We get the idea, right?
Those are all really good.
Right.
I think there's a book title in there
Right,
somewhere.
there's somewhere, right?
Yeah.
But that's why, because the thing is a word. So words are magic. And you can see the twinkle in your eye, when you get the magic of words. And when words aren't magic, they betray something. So there's something very beautiful, and I'm gonna, we could use Sanskrit and we could use French literature, we could use, Buddhist texts, but my native set of texts, and I love all those sets of texts and play in them, but my kind of native original set of texts is kind of Aramaic Hebrew. So I often kind of go back there. And so in Hebrew, so we all know there's an alpha. So alpha is aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, alpha waves, aleph. And aleph is the silent letter. So aleph is the deep silence beneath the word, right? But not a silence of absence, but a silence of presence, a silence in which no word could capture the depth of that, right? Your best moment with Allison, whatever that moment was, sometimes it's a silent moment. There's just nothing to say, right? KK and I were sitting together and we just get quiet and we're just in the space together. And so we're in that silence that's beneath words. And then the word emerges, and the word is supposed to give shape, to dress the silence and to ornament the silence. That's what the word does at its best. But the word can also betray the silence, because words actually, they're opposites joined at the hip. So in Hebrew, you have aleph, the depth of silence, silence of presence. Then you have BCD, so A, aleph. Then BCD, Beit Gimel Daled, which means beged, which means betrayal. Right? So it's the betrayal of the word is when the word doesn't ornament the silence, when the word becomes alienated from the silence. And there's really, in some sense, I'd say there's two kinds of people, and both kinds are beautiful, but one's trustable and the other's not. Right. Meaning, in other words, there are people who speak. You can feel that their words come from the silence, that there's silence underneath the word. And there's other kind of people, and those two kinds of people could be us at different moments in our lives also, right? Where we speak to cover up the silence.
Ah, so good.
Right? And that distinction is that's just a word on word that was so important.
That's great. It reminds me of, and I know you'll track the other part.
Yeah, I'm with you. Enlightenment suffering. We're going to come back to it. Okay.
But it reminds me of something a teacher used to tell me about music. And he would say, Luke, the music's not the notes. The music's what's behind the notes. It's sort of like that silent under the word, and there's like, why does a certain note or a combination of notes that comprise a chord elicit a feeling? Like, what is that?
Right.
What is that and why?
What is that and why?
It doesn't really matter, but we know that it's true, right?
And it's literally true when you look at the science of music, which is a separate podcast. It's one of the things I'm most fascinated by. It's so important, the science of music. But music emerges. What music is originally is the rhythm between the pulsations. And it's about the space in between, and it's how that space in between, how the moments in between then create music. So music is actually literally created from the space in between.
Right.
And the space in between is...
that's so cool. Just like sound.
The silence.
Sound is created by or not created by, but exists because there's the silence beneath it.
Literally.
Right? If there wasn't a context in a field of silence, there would be no noise. There would be no sound.
That's right. And so music arises at the very beginning of the space-time continuum, right? And that's very, very beautiful. Now, let's shift back, to the second very beautiful opening, which is the relationship of enlightenment to suffering. And it's such an important topic, and it's so confused in both in the writings, right, of many of the traditions. And so let's try and make a distinction. The more clarified my awareness, the more I'm in the depth of true nature, the more unnecessary suffering falls away, right? So I walk in and I say, wow, this is a really nice room in Luke's house, and this is a really spacious downstairs, and it felt so great. Why is this not my house? Right? In other words, right? So I say, oh, well, actually, that's not my story. I didn't, right? And as we have different vectors and different stories, so that I get to walk in and be really excited that Luke and Allison live in this beautiful place, right? So that'd be just a simple banal example, right? In other words, unnecessary suffering, right? So I can, by clarifying my own identity and becoming more sane, I don't confuse my identity with yours. Iago goes after Othello, right? And is just completely eviscerated in his interiors by Othello's eros and goes to murder him, right? And so jealousy, contraction, pettiness, right, all come from a dissociation from my own true nature and from my own unique true nature, right? And as jealousy always means, I want to be you in some way. And if I want to be you, it means I'm actually not, if I'm I because you're you and you're you because I'm I, then I'm not I and you're not you. I have to actually be in devotion to your you-ness, and I can only do that if I'm located in my true nature. So yes, absolutely, the Buddha wasn't wrong, in his developmental sequence that enlightenment reduces suffering. That's absolutely true. And there's a quality of suffering that's mystery. And this is just so important. We try and explain suffering because we want to get a handle on it. So we try and explain it through classical religion. You sinned, now you're being punished. Sin and punishment. That's one move. That's a Western tradition move, classical Western religion. The Eastern move is not you sinned, your mind wasn't clear, right? Your mind wasn't clear. You couldn't get clarity of mind, so therefore you suffer. Move two. Move 3 in intellectual history is kind of very, very popular in the contemporary kind of new age human potential world. You attracted it into your life, right? How many times have we heard that, right? What did you do to attract that into your life? And go seek how you, right?
Yeah, it's
All
funny.
3 of those moves.
Some people call that victim shaming.
Victim shaming, right? And there's quite a bit of that. But if you go to,
But I don't entirely believe that's true. But that is kind of a mind virus we have now.
It's
right?
a mind, and there's some truth, and each one of these 3 is true but partial. It's not that they're completely wrong, right? There's a spark of truth in each one of them, and each one of them, if you kind of step out and look at the broad field, they're all making the same move, and the move is you can get a handle on the suffering thing, which is beautiful. That's part of human agency and human power and human capacity for transformation. And it's also a move for control at the same time. There's a subtle move for control. In other words, if I sinned and therefore I'm being punished, I could stop sinning and not get punished, right? If I'm suffering because my mind's not clear, I could get my mind clear and not suffer. Right? If I attract it into my life, and that's why I'm suffering, I could not attract it into my life by doing some, inner transformation. I'll do the avatar seminar, I'll do the forum, and I'll get it handled, or Life Spring, or whatever it happens to be, right? And those are all legitimate. I want to just a blessing to that. Werner Erhard called me a bunch of years ago. We had a couple of great talks, and we sat actually at a lobby of a hotel in San Francisco for 5 hours and just compared notes. We had a great time, and I think Werner did a great job at doing a particular thing, and not such a great job at doing some other things, but he made a real contribution. And so there's all these things are true but partial. And in the end, one of the first principles and first values of cosmos is what we know and what we don't know. So there's gnosis, that which we can know, and that which we can actually get certainty on, and we know things. Postmodernity was wrong when it said we don't know anything. We know shit. Right? Gnosis is a real possibility. And there's mystery. And mystery means, wow, we don't know. And we're actually able to live in the mystery. And the more I love, the more I can hold on certainty. It's a paradox, right? The less I love, the more I need certainty. And even in relationship, everywhere, the less I love, the more certainty I need to replace the fullness of the eros of love. The more I love, the more I can hold on certainty. And so there's a dimension of cosmos, which is mystery. And suffering, after all the explanations, when I was 29, Luke, I sat for 6 months. I didn't move out of like one room, and I wrote a 400-page, way too footnoted kind of deep meditation on suffering. Because it's right. What do you do with suffering? Right? What do you do with suffering? And so there's a dimension of suffering that's mystery that can't be addressed by not attracting into your life, and it can't be addressed by clarifying your mind and knowing your true nature, and it can't be addressed by sin punishment. There's a dimension of mystery in the world. Now, the way we can respond is 2 ways. One is we go to heal suffering. That's not an answer, that's a response. Meaning it's a mystery, but we get to respond. We live in a world of outrageous pain. The only response is outrageous love. So we actually go to heal, to transform. That's one response. And the other response is we realize that the fact of suffering, and even the fact of evil, that evil and suffering are not what tell us that there's no goodness, truth, and beauty, which is the classical position you'll hear all over the place, right? And it's how could you speak of goodness, truth, and beauty? How could you speak of spirit? Take a look at Rwanda. Right, Deepak Chopra sent me a little while ago a book that he put out with Leonard Mlodinow a few years ago. It was called, what was it called? He was all excited about it. It was called War of the Worldviews. And in it, Leonard, who's a Caltech physicist, essentially basically says, you know what, fuck this, right? My mother was in Auschwitz, and here's what happened. And there was a commandant who walked behind, 10 prisoners and randomly killed one, and then killed the third one, killed the fifth one. Like, don't give me any kind of like, Deepak, go away. That was a good question. Deepak didn't respond to it because the assumption is there's nothing to respond. There is. And the response is so subtle, it's so profound, it's so beautiful, which is the only reason we're bothered by evil, The only reason suffering offends us is because we live in an intimate universe. We live in a universe which is good and true and beautiful. And because we think the world should be just and it should be fair, that actually is the God force in us. And hence that which thinks the world should be fair and good, and that truth and beauty are real, and that there's a pattern of intimate beauty to cosmos, is wildly offended by suffering. But if the world was just a reductive materialist world, if it was happenstance, if it was, Shakespeare, a tale told by an idiot, full of sounds and fury signifying nothing, what's the problem with evil? Why would you expect there not to be suffering? Of course there's suffering. It's just a mechanistic, random world, tale told by an idiot. Faulkner rewrote that book, The Sound and the Fury, based on Shakespeare. No reason to expect it to be any different. But we do expect it to be different. We're wildly offended, devastated by suffering, right? Brothers Karamazov, right? I'm offended even in Alyosha talk. I'm offended. We view suffering as repulsive to the God force. That's true, right? Which is why we know there's a God force, right? In other words, we're offended by suffering because the universe is good. And that's very beautiful. All of a sudden you realize, the great question of suffering is not an answer, but it tells you that you live in an intimate universe, because suffering or evil is a failure of intimacy at its core. So that was a lot. Was that too much?
It's never too much. On to the existence of suffering and evil, which you kind of say are partners, right? Partners in crime,
right? There's a lot to say about disambiguating them, but for now,
I mean, just to say, like, evil generally manifests as some degree of suffering for someone, right?
Right. So, for now we'll leave they can be split apart, and they should be split apart. But for now, we can hold them together.
We'll bucket them temporarily.
Temporary bucket.
I am not an atheist. I've had experiences in my life that unequivocally prove to me that there is some universal, omnipotent, loving force present in me and around me, and everything is imbued with that.
Yeah.
Not all the time, because I lose my awareness of it, but still at times it's been difficult for me to reconcile, and I'm sure this is much more difficult for someone who's atheist or agnostic, is the existence of evil. It's that question, well, if there's a God, then what about Rwanda, right?
Right.
And this is something I've teased apart in all sorts of experiences, meditations, ceremonies, etc. And the closest that I can get to reconciling the duality, let's just call it duality, is that since this thing that we refer to as God is infinite, and it's only one thing, in order for it to experience itself, it seems to manifest itself infinitely as all things. And those things, from our subjective positionality, we would call, well, good over here and evil over here, but it's all God. So that's the first part.
Right.
And second part is that, speaking of just the earth realm here, that if there was no suffering and if there was no existence of evil, in other words, if there wasn't a spectrum of consciousness that could be traversed from low to high and vice versa, the world would be pointless if the purpose of the world and our being here is to burn negative karma and to gain positive karma. In other words, it's like the duality that's created, and the suffering and the evil and the bliss and the love.
Right.
And all of that is here with the purpose, because it gives us an opportunity to go to school. Right? It's like if you send a postgraduate student to kindergarten, there'd be very little utility value in that experience.
Right.
So we seem to need this broad spectrum of a playground here, right? Where I can, through my own agency and my will, have the opportunity to be a serial killer or a saint, right? And if we were all saints, then there would be no elevation to which we aspired to go.
Yeah. See, here's the thing.
What's your take on that realm? I guess what I'm saying is I've reconciled duality, by finding a value in it for myself, that I now have something that I can do here.
Yeah, and you're taking the tack and very beautifully and very eloquently of the classical religions.
Okay.
And they basically go in that direction. And there's some pretty wise people there, so you're in good company, right?
Okay.
And there's some real truth in that, right? Choice, right? Without choice, we couldn't transform, right? The transformation of the human being can only happen in this field of duality, right? And that's all true.
Okay. And
those are called in the great traditions theodicies.
okay.
How do we explain suffering? And there's some deep and real obvious truth in them, and they're insufficient.
Okay.
Right? Because when you look at a baby suffering, right? When you look at 12,000 people gassed a day in Auschwitz, there's nothing you can say in the face of burning children. There's no words that. And one of religion's great mistakes was its attempt to explain suffering. Before we explain suffering, we have to actually say, I don't know. We actually have to hold the mystery and say, here's what we do know. We know that our experience, you described your personal experiences that brought you to some sense of knowing that the world has order and has meaning and, has goodness, right? And so those experiences are true. I can actually have a firsthand, direct experience of goodness, truth, and beauty, of order, of cosmic consciousness, of, meaning. I know that's true. And I know I can't explain the suffering. And so I actually, like I do in a love relationship, I hold the mystery, right? So I live in that space, which I'm madly in love with reality. And I know that love is real. And I know that we live in a cosmo-erotic universe in which eros is real. And I can't explain suffering, and I live in that mystery. And I think spirit loses people when it attempts to explain suffering. And it's when Deepak attempted to explain it to Mladeno, he lost him. Correctly so, right? And, there's this moment in the original Genesis text when God, the God force, and when we say God, the God you don't believe in doesn't exist. So whatever God means, whatever that, the force of meaning and goodness and cosmos. I often refer to God, Luke, as not the infinity of power, but the infinity of intimacy. And, in each generation, we need a new name of God. So we're trying to write a new story of value, at the center in response to the meta crisis. And the name of God that we've kind of emerged, and she kind of whispered in our ear, is we call God the infinite intimate. God is the infinite intimate. It's beautiful, right? God's the infinite intimate. So the infinite intimate says to Abraham, I'm going to destroy, the famous story, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. So Abraham should say, God's talking. God's clearly got this calculation worked out. Okay. God's the ultimate spiritual teacher. And Abraham says, really? No. And God said, what do you mean? I'm God. You're Abraham. And Abraham says, no, actually, no. And Abraham says, Shofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. Will the judge of the whole world not do justice? And the implication in there is that Abram challenges the divine and refuses to accept any explanation for human suffering. And God says, no, here's why I'm doing this. I got this covered. I'm God. Abram says, no, sorry. I reject any explanation for human suffering. And that's a theme all through the lineage, is that any explanation for human suffering is not kosher. Any move to do theologic, right? Theologic of different, actually deadens our sensitivity to the suffering. We actually have to look at the suffering and scream, right? We live in a world of outrageous pain, and don't use any theology or any metaphysics to deaden our sensitivity to the pain. And actually, when we look at suffering, one of my masters, he died in the early 19th century, Nachman of Breslov, who Kafka loved, says that when you see suffering, you have to become an atheist. But not that you suspend belief or trust in the meaningfulness of cosmos, but you have to take the response to it on yourself. You see a poor person, you're an atheist. There's no God to take care of it. You take care of it. It's yours to do. So that's what I mean. We live in a world of outrageous pain. The only response to outrageous pain is outrageous love, and outrageous lovers commit outrageous acts of love. We become the God field. In any attempt to actually ameliorate or to soften the utter outrage at suffering is a violation of the divine. We suffer with the divine, right? And divinity suffers infinitely. So if divinity is infinity of power and infinity of intimacy, that means divinity is also infinity of pain.
Yeah, yeah.
So she suffers, right? That baby in Rwanda, she doesn't avert her eye. We look at it for a second. She's living in that suffering, and that infinity of pain that lives in us has to move us to become the God force and to create, that new world, that most beautiful, good, true world that we know is possible. And we avoid all explanations of suffering.
Well, this is a really good point,
right?
Because it's
Beautiful.
As I've come to find peace with suffering, evil, the other side of the scale of the duality, to even explain it, that I'm okay with all the suffering, right? And all the evil. But at the same time, I'm not complacent.
Right.
And I'm not uncaring.
Right.
And part of my contribution to that understanding is to step in and to be helpful, to step in front of a bullet.
Right.
Right.
All of that.
So
you got to hold both.
To serve.
Right.
But I think some people view that perspective of like, no, this is the way God designed the world. Just leave it alone. It doesn't mean that you're inactive or passive or uncaring. Like it is the playground that's been created that gives me the opportunity to help alleviate suffering. If there was no suffering there, then I wouldn't be able to do that. I wouldn't be able to access that expression of myself, which is really what I'm doing here on this podcast. I mean, that's the core of it.
No, gorgeous.
I mean, on all the podcasts that I record, ultimately, whether they're about the physical or the metaphysical, it's elevating consciousness and alleviating suffering, that we might spark an idea in someone that changes the trajectory of their feeling or thoughts and then behavior.
So your intention on this podcast is to alleviate suffering. It's very beautiful, right? And that's a very clear intention. And so what I'm just trying to tenderly do, or maybe not so tenderly, right? But fiercely, but always with quivering tenderness underneath the fierceness, is we want to stay outraged about suffering, right? Pain is outrageous. I have a friend here in Austin, John, who's a grocer, Whole Foods. So John was the board chair of our think tank for a bunch of years. And John called me once, and John's a great guy, right? And John said, Mark, I don't think you should talk about outrageous pain. Let's call it unlimited pain, right? So that's a nice word.
I like that.
Right? Because outrageous has the word rage in it. And so, I laughed and I said, John and I tease each other about this over the years. No, it's got to be outrageous, right? You have to experience rage, right? The prophet experiences rage. If you look at suffering, you're not outraged, you're actually dissociated and alienated from the God field. And so, there's that movie some 25 years ago. I can't remember who started it. It was called Network.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Where he goes bananas on the propaganda machine.
That's right. He goes right, and
classic.
And he says,
I should watch that again because it'd be so relevant in the times in which we live now.
That's such a great movie. And he says, I want everyone to go out to the window and say, I'm mad. I'm mad, and I just not gonna take it anymore.
Yeah.
And so he's accessing outrage.
Yeah.
And what metaphysics does is it actually blunts outrage, paradoxically. So I think we actually need to not get okay with it at all, and at the same time realize that it doesn't take me out of the God field, because the fact that I'm outraged tells me I live in a universe that's good. As I wouldn't be outraged if the universe was neutral. So it's so gorgeous that the question of why itself is not the answer, because there's no answer, but it's the response. There'd be no challenge, right? Suffering would not offer me any challenge if I lived in a world which was a tale told by an idiot full of sounds and furies signifying nothing. Suffering's only a challenge because I know that I live in the field of the good and the true and the beautiful. Suffering violates that field. So the fact that I'm outraged by suffering actually relocates me in the God field, in the divine field, in the field of goodness, truth, and beauty. And I'm outraged. So then it demands, right, outrageous acts of love. Now, What we just did is we just rewrote 2,000 years of history, right? In other words, what we just did is we just rejected the theodicies of the great traditions, not because they were wrong, that they each have something important to say. They're each true but partial, but they actually are insufficient and they're offensive. There's something obscene in them. And all of secular modernity arises in rejection of the religious explanations of suffering. So I want to get how source code this is. If we could, from the perspective of meaning, approach suffering in a different way, that's a source code evolution move. Voltaire starts, his revolution, remember the cruelties. Hume, Rousseau, Hobbes, right? Montesquieu. I mean, the entire Western tradition is about the rejection of religious explanations of suffering. Right? And the East doesn't do any better. Right? The East kind of works out the Tao, and it's all very nice, right? And I love Taoism, and I live deeply inside of it, and I love Vajrayana and Mahayana, Theravada a little bit less, right? But it's a mistake. No, it's not just clarifying the mind. It's not just we're going to move beyond life as suffering. No. We're outraged by suffering. And it's the posture of the new human and the new humanity is we're not just Homo sapien, we're love in person, we're Homo amor. Right? I'm Homo amor. I'm an irreducible, unique expression of the love, intelligence, and love beauty. And when I see suffering, I'm outraged. But not in a way that takes me out of the God field, not in the way that turns me into, Ivan
Turns
and
you
Brothers
into the thing that
Karamazov.
you're outraged by.
That's right. It doesn't turn me into a monster. And it doesn't.
That's what we see so much in our culture, especially starting around 2016. I hate the people that hate. It's just like,
right.
You just see the wheels spinning, going nowhere,
And
it's not the way up and out.
It's not the way up and out. And that's so true in our culture, right? In other words, what we do in our culture is we say, we're outraged by your position because we don't realize that both of us are in the field of value. And in the field of value can express itself in competing perspectives, but we actually don't experience ourselves as being in the field of value. And it's very subtle. When I'm not in the field of value, I'm outside the Tao. I'm outside the field of value. Then my position is not an expression of value, it's my identity.
Bingo.
Right?
Yeah.
And if it's my identity, I'm never going to compromise on my identity. So my identity conflicts with your identity.
That puts a lot of pieces together.
Doesn't it really?
Yeah. Well, in terms of what we see now with the influx of cultural Marxism, for lack of a better term, but it's as though it's not as though people are being encouraged to self-identify in all of these micro-identifies that aren't actually inherently who they are.
Right. Because we have no identity.
Yeah.
So there's a vacuum of identity.
And then when the way I perceive it, at least, is when the ego goes, "Oh, I'm that. I'm going to grab that and identify with that so deeply and so intimately."
The ego hijacks that identity.
Yeah. Then that becomes my perception and my identification of who and what I am. Therefore, anything that threatens that identity directly and personally threatens me and puts me on the defense or offense against those who aren't that.
Luke, that's gorgeous. Let's play with it. That's
and
gorgeous.
It's such a mind fuck because it's such a disservice.
It's such a disservice
to humanity. And people are blindly and innocently going along with it because the people that have put these ideas into motion and injected them into culture know what they're doing. This is the conspiratorial part of me, that the illusion is something we're so prone to because of our tribalism and just the way that we identify with ego, that if you give us that menu and say, pick that one, and I pick that, then I become entrapped and enslaved unto myself without even needing an oppressor to do it.
Yeah,
because of the inherent division.
So let's go slow. So there's two parts here. So one is, and they're both true, we need to look at them carefully. So one is, there is something called propaganda, which is real. Propaganda is not something that appears on some, fringe podcast that's made up. Propaganda is a very clear and intentional methodology.
It's not just on a billboard from USSR.
Right. That's right.
Like we think of propaganda as like iconography or something,
right?
But it's a more prolific mind virus, and it's multifaceted.
Propaganda is actually the way culture works, and it's actually quite organized and quite intentional, right? And it is organized by the legacy institutions, and there's an enormous amount of information on that, which is very, very real. So that's one. Two, so there are bad actors, but they're bad actors for one of two reasons. Either because there are some really demonic bad actors. There are real bad actors in the world. That's true. But generally, the bad actors view themselves as good actors. That they basically say, oh, we're confronted by risk, different forms of existential risk. One of the first people who fit into this world was B.F. Skinner at Harvard for 6 decades at Harvard, right? He's the rating psychologist. We're actually myself and Zach Stein, about to come out with a book. It's probably going to be authored by David J. Temple, right? Which is a very careful analysis of the MIT Media Lab, which is at the center of the Webplex, and the source of the MIT Media Lab's thinking in B.F. Skinner.
Oh, interesting.
Which is quite shocking. And B.F. Skinner basically operates under the assumption that the only way to respond to this risk is to control the whole system. You control it through propaganda. B.F. Skinner talks about being able to control rats and pigeons and what he calls Skinner's boxes, where invisible levers of control the rats and pigeons. And if you study the MIT Media Lab carefully, particularly the writings of one of its figures, Sandy Pentland, who's not a demon. I'd be delighted to have Sandy over for dinner, but he's operating under the assumption that spirit's not real, that value is not real. Therefore, we need to control the system. We can't let people know they're being controlled. So we have to use the levers of social media to actually control and to create reality as a Skinner's box. And the word that Pentland uses for Skinner's box, euphemistically, is living laboratory. Right? He calls the Skinner's box. There's 23 core issues, which we won't get into now. It's its own podcast, where Pentland is directly drawing on Skinner, pretends like he doesn't know Skinner. But when you read the language carefully, it's very clear that he does. And I read through kind of all Skinner's works and pretty much all Pentland's works, because I'm crazy, right? And we have to do real work. We have to be grounded. And it's very, very clear that this notion that you're talking about, this move to control and that which the conspiratorial world doesn't actually ground itself in, it just kind of makes claims. Actually, there's something very real there. So there is propaganda, which is real, that moves to control the system. That's true. But there's something even more insidious, which is the reason we reduce human beings, the reason human beings don't actually act from their highest, the reason that we have these essentially pseudo-eros self-understandings is because we don't have a good story about who we are. In other words, what a conspiracy theory is a story about what's going on. Now, when you're not operating in a deeper story, what is the story of cosmos? When we don't have a universe story, because we only have a regressive fundamentalist story, but we don't have a new universe story, which tells us enlightenment. What's the nature of reality? There'll be lots of uncertainty, but what is reality? I don't actually get that reality is actually a love story. The reality is not just a fact, it is a story, and it's not just an ordinary story, it's actually a love story. And it's not a Pollyannish love story. It's got filled with agony and ecstasy, but it's a love story. From quarks, all the way to subatomic particles that become atoms, to atoms become molecules, and molecules become macromolecules. It's actually a story of allurement, of separate parts becoming larger wholes, right? Of new synergies and new emergences. Reality is actually a love story. That's actually its nature, right? If you don't get reality as a love story, so you don't get reality as eros, then you're left with no plot line. When you're left with no plot line, you got to fill something in.
Boom.
Conspiracy.
And they're
reductive materialist.
And there is born your identity that in some cases has been handed you through propaganda on a silver platter.
So you
gobble it up like one of Skinner's rats.
Exactly. So you just tied us back in, which is gorgeous. So what happens?
That's cool.
So there's no storyline. So I'm not actually an expression of eros. I'm not an irreducible, unique self. I'm not, who is Luke, a unique configuration of eros. But if I'm not a unique configuration of eros, of the field of eros, so then I'm empty. Emptiness is unimaginably painful. So I don't have eros, I need pseudo-eros. So pseudo-eros is a contrived identity.
Oh man,
I'm
God,
left. I'm right. And that's polarization.
we see so much of that right now too.
Right? Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, and the momentum behind it is just staggering. Like
It's
if
staggering.
you went in a time machine and just went back 3 or 4 years and popped out today, you'd be like, "What is happening?"
And let's just see how critical is what we're saying, brother, because we're trying to actually get beneath all the punditry. There hasn't been one intelligent article in the New York Times, on CNN, or Fox News, not one, right? Or in Germany or in France, et cetera, which actually explains well polarization. What we've just done is we've actually unpacked what polarization is. Polarization comes from the experience that I'm not in the field of value. I'm not in the field of eros, that my story is not part of a larger story. I can't live without a story, without a plot line, without a self-understanding, without the eros of self-understanding. Pseudo-eros comes in, I create a contrived identity. If I have a contrived identity, I'm Republican, I'm Democrat, I'm left, I'm right. I die for my identity because I don't have anything else.
Yeah.
That's polarization.
Right.
But if
right.
we both step into the field of value, meaning, I'll just give you an example. So let's say Luke and Mark are both in the field of value. We're in the field of value, and we're arguing over abortion, which is obviously a critically important issue. Now, you might tend towards pro-life, or I might, or you might tend towards pro-choice. But actually, we can hear each other because you're not saying, if you're out of the field of value, you say I'm pro-life, meaning life's my only value. I ignore choice as a value.
And I'm saying I am that.
And I am
ignoring what I really am.
That's right. So I'm not. So instead of us both being in the field of value, in which we realize if we're in the field of value, we realize, oh, life's a value, and choice is a value. So both life and choice are expressions of a deeper field of value. So we're both in the field of value. The field of value is beneath life and choice. It's the field of value. Then that field of value expresses itself uniquely as life and choice, two individual values. But we're both in the field of value. So when you say life matters, I say, oh, of course, it's a very important value. When I say choice matters, you say, of course, choice is a very important value. So now life and choice need to synergize, and we need to create a more whole new set of values that can actually embrace both positions. But if we're both outside the field of value, so then...
And out of that is born compromise and negotiation.
And not compromise and negotiation, which is a sellout.
Okay.
Right? And
cooperation? Like what
synergy,
comes out of that?
Synergy.
Okay.
Something more
I'm just
whole.
Thinking about legislation and
you're
how
right,
things actually manifest through that.
No, absolutely. But that legislation's not because we're giving up. Well, I can't give up any of my value life because I'm betraying God. No, I recognize that your value is also an expression of the God field. Choice. So now we synergize and we create a whole greater than the sum of the parts. So we've got choice, we've got life. They're both in the field of value. So then those two values have to fructify each other, and they've got to generate a new emergent. That's how evolution works. Evolution works when there's an intimacy between parts, in this case, values. They're not dissociated. They come together and something new emerges. Now, let me try and say just one. We have another minute on this?
Yeah.
This is crazy important.
It's super cool. I love it.
This is where all goes wrong in culture. So remember we talked about the levels of self. We said there's separate self, completely separate, puzzle piece by itself, no puzzle. Then we said there's true self. I'm one with the field. Then we said there's unique self. I'm a unique expression of the field. Okay? So let's look at it this way. One way of understanding value is, right, as separate self. So there's life, there's choice, there's separate self. They're not in the field of value. Separate selves clash with each other. They fight. They try and kill each other. That's what Hobbes writes, right? There's a state of war. But if I actually move into, I'm now in the field of value, I realize, life and choice, those are both expressions of the field of value. In fact, those are unique self. Those are unique expressions. They're not separate self. They're unique expressions of the field of value. Those unique expressions of the field of value, they come together and then they evolve something new. They become a new evolutionary unique self that evolves the whole field. We're living in a different world now. We just described a different world. In other words, polarization comes from the inability to realize that it's not a contradiction, it's a paradox in which both sides are actually holding value. It's a shocking realization. What we do is we glom onto value, we hijack value for identity. That's the source of all polarization. And here's the weird thing, last sentence. Both the fundamentalist Christian community on this issue and the liberal progressive community, they're both out of the field of value. Because you would think, oh, the fundamentalist Christians, they're in the field of value. And those postmodern liberal progressives, they're out of the field of value. It's not true. The fundamentalist Christians are not in the field of value. They're saying, no, there is no field of value. There's only our position. The Muslims are wrong. The Jews are wrong. The progressive Christians are wrong. That's not the field of value. That's actually, I'm not in the field of value. There's just one unique configuration and one value. That's the only truth. It means they've stepped out of the field of value. They can't hear the resonances of value. And of course, the progressive liberal position is generally postmodern. There is no field of value. So actually, both postmodern progressives and regressive fundamentalist Christians have both stepped out of the field of value. So they can't hear each other. Now, that's true on every issue. And here's the crazy thing. Remember Dick Nixon?
You consider running for president?
Right. But isn't that beautiful?
Like, he's got it. This is it.
It's so beautiful.
Yeah. Imagine though,
right?
And I'm not blowing smoke here. I mean, it's beautiful the way you're able to break this down. But imagine if you heard a legitimate politician speaking about our culture in this way, right?
And we used to. Right, here's what we used to.
Dick Nixon?
Here's the interesting thing. So Dick Nixon, John Kennedy. We all know that they had a big presidential contestation in 1960. If we followed it carefully, we know that Joe Kennedy probably stole the election. That's there's lots of literature on that. Let's not go down that road. And it's the notion that, that's a whole other conversation. But actually, Dick Nixon and Jack Kennedy were friends. They became friends in 1947 on a train ride where they shared a bunk, going to Washington. And they remained friends all through the 50s. And then they had this quite bitter, contestation. They remained friends afterwards. They were in touch afterwards, right? Because they had this deep sense that they were in a shared field of value. It was before kind of post-modernity, which is really modernity on steroids, essentially deconstructed the field of value, right? And if I can, go like just deep for 10 seconds for people, right? So modernity borrowed social capital from pre-modernity. And the social capital it borrowed was the field of value. Modernity said, we're not sure how to work this out, but let's just assume there's a field of value. So they borrowed social capital from pre-modernity, the traditional world. The loan just sat there. Along came post-modernity and called in the loan. Said, fuck you guys. There is no field of value. You guys made it up. You just borrowed it. It's not true. That's what post-modernity did. It called in the loan. It said there is no field of value. If you get an award, you're going to say 500 years in 3 sentences. That's essentially what happened.
I just had a vision of an animation of this, right?
That's great.
It'd be great to see the characters play this out.
Isn't that great?
Yeah.
You can Jack Kennedy and Dick Nixon are still in the field of modernity. So they haven't worked it out in their minds exactly how it works. And Jack Kennedy's not really a Catholic, but he sort of is and sort of is not. And Dick Nixon is kind of a Lutheran Protestant and Presbyterian, sort of is. But they both assume, they haven't worked this out, and we're in a field of value. And so basically, they look at each other and they just assume that which unites us is so much greater than that which divides us. Right? And Nixon wrote such a beautiful note to Jackie when John was killed. Right? And you felt, and they liked each other. Can you imagine today, right? Can you imagine today two figures that contested so deeply in the public sphere being good friends? And we've lost the sense that we're in a shared field of value, which is the source of polarization. And polarization is one of the 3 fundamental causes for existential risk. So what we're talking about here is not a meta-theoretical, academic intellectual tease conversation, right? This is everything. This is everything. If we don't understand the dynamics that creates polarization, we're fucked.
And there can be no civility without a field of value, because the field of value is the intimacy that draws us together as different,
oh my God,
but part of the same whole.
You're my new best friend,
right?
Right. Yes. And in others, at the core of everything is a global intimacy disorder.
Yeah.
I love right there. That's exactly right. There's a global intimacy. And what causes intimacy, right? So Allison and Luke, right? And so we're not going to do since I know nothing about your marriage, right? So we're not going to do a kind
It's a
of
beautiful marriage.
Marriage conversation. It's beautiful. It's I understand, but in other words, so why does it work? Why is it a beautiful marriage? Right? What's, and of course you've got your ups and downs, which everyone has in the world, except for, of course, me and Christina, who are perfect, right? But in other words, so why, right? Why is it a beautiful marriage? Because there's some shared field of value, right? In other words, and all of the other issues that we try and work on in a marriage, which we all try and work on, and everyone tries to work on their relationship, and we all should, but those only work if we're in a shared field of value. So if there's no field of value between Mark and Christina, between, Allison and Luke, then we can't have intimacy. Intimacy requires a shared field of value. So an intimacy disorder at its core is actually a breakdown in the shared field of value, right? And everything else is an expression of that. That's a big deal. So a global intimacy disorder, which is, I think, the root cause of existential risk, right? Existential risk is based on win-lose dynamics and rivalrous conflict, number one, that generates fragile systems, number two. That's a longer conversation. Those are the generator functions. But underneath those generator functions is a root cause. The root cause is a global intimacy disorder. But the global intimacy disorder is rooted in a collapse of a shared story of value. So therefore, the way to respond to existential risk is to reconstruct a shared story of value.
Boom.
Boom. It's like, boom, right? That's what we're doing here.
So if we've got, let's just simplify it. We've got two parties. And I think the pro-life and pro-choice positionality was a good framing because there's so much polarity there. So say we've got both sides of that or any issue, and there's a circle in the room of value, and both of us are standing outside of that circle. And the solution to synergy is for us to at least begin by getting back in that circle of shared value.
Step back into the
Okay.
right.
So how is this possible when you have such vast numbers of people that are living with unhealed trauma and addictions, for example, myself included in the earlier part of life, where I was reduced to my base nature, to my animal nature, to such a degree that the only field of value in my capacity and available to me is how do I survive the next 5 minutes?
Right.
Right?
Which is what addiction's about at its core.
Yeah.
Right.
And then, having had the grace and good fortune to overcome that, then, the world starts broadening a bit and my perspective starts to open because, wow, I have to find meaning. I have to find value, or I'm going to, again, be reduced to my base nature and all of the inherent suffering that comes with that. So as we sit here, we're two men that are, the refrigerator's full. We're not in fight or flight suffering. We've worked on ourselves. We continue to work on ourselves. We're awakening. So you and I could have a conversation like this where we're agreeing in a shared field of value and we can work toward a solution and synergy and cooperation. But how do we invite someone in who's still in a lower state of consciousness and caught in that suffering?
So, no, that's beautiful. It's such a beautiful inquiry. Thank you, right? In other words, we have to be able to heal the field of culture itself. In other words, what's broken is the field of value in culture. So there's a kind of death of the father, right? And the father is the call of value. We love the mother, and I have written, volumes on the mother, many volumes, a decade of my life writing about she, the field of the mother. And so the mother's unimaginably important. And that's a whole conversation. But there's a mother and a father. And the mother is the intrinsic value of everything at all times. But the mother doesn't always make a demand. When I say the mother, I don't mean the gendered mother. I mean the mother, the archetype, the mother, the quality of mother. And then the father, though, the father says, there's something to do here. There's a demand. Now, the father got hijacked by the great religions. right? Just like the mother did. The mother got hijacked by some of the early traditions, the great mother traditions, which were very beautiful and also bloodthirsty and horrific. They were very complex religions. The father religions also had great beauty and were also bloodthirsty and horrific in their own ways, right? The Western traditions. You got to liberate the spark of the mother traditions and liberate the spark of the father traditions. Each one has a spark of the sacred. Each one is a broken vessel, but in that broken vessel, there's a spark of the sacred. And we need to actually create a new world religion as a context for our diversity, right? A new possibility. And in that new space, we need to actually re-invoke the blessing of the father, right, and the blessing of the mother that come together and actually invoke this field of value that calls us to something. And so, let me give you an example. 1,000 years ago, ask a 7-year-old about democracy or an 85-year-old wise one, and they'll look at you like, democracy what? Human beings are going to choose their own government? It's just an utterly insane idea. Now, ask any 7-year-old, at least in the Western world, about democracy, and they'll say, oh, of course. So that idea has now stepped into consciousness. So there's a field of value in which democracy is an expression of that field of value, and it's accessible to 7-year-olds. Interesting, right? So what we did is we deconstructed the field of value. So when we deconstruct the field of value and I'm only a separate self, that's all I am, means I come into this world at birth, ages, 0 days till 2 years, right? I get traumatized. I'm wounded. I'm hurt. And my entire existence is I'm a prisoner of childhood, Melanie Klein. I'm traumatized and devastated, right? Because of the early lack of attunements in my life and whatever they happen to be. And attachment theory is very real. And attachment theory is an enormous evolution of consciousness, an enormous contribution, but it's also fundamentally flawed because it assumes reductive materialist assumptions, right? And what does it assume? It assumes that, everything happens between the moment you're born or prenatal, 9 months before, and, your first several years. Means you come into this world and there's no prior existence. There's no larger field of value. There's no continuity of consciousness. So therefore, if there's nothing else but this, well, then everything must have been formed then. If you were in some sense deformed in the time you're supposed to be formed, you're traumatized. How can you ever move beyond it? That's our assumption. That's a tragic assumption. What's actually more true is I'm born out of a field of value into a field of value. I'm a unique configuration of value. I'm born into a particular life that forms me in a particular way, which is part of the invitation and destiny of my life, but I'm called by something larger. I'm not just formed by the traumas of yesterday within my lifetime. I'm actually intended by cosmos. I was born in a particular time that I didn't choose, in a particular place that I didn't choose, with a particular set of proclivities that I didn't choose, at a particular time in history I didn't choose. Why do I think I'm so in charge of this, right? In other words, and I'm needed by cosmos, and my particular set of circumstances are the fate that I need to turn into destiny. That's much more interesting. So it's not just I'm controlled by yesterday's past, I'm actually called by value itself. I live in a field of value. I live in the eternity of value in the present, and I'm called by value into the future. So what we have to do is we have to realign the field. We can't do it through individual trauma work, although that needs to be done. Trauma work's enormously important. We all need to do that work.
Pardon the interruption, though. Is not one way in which the field is influenced, though, by my healing of my trauma and then producing offspring and being a loving, kind, attentive father?
The healing of my trauma,
like the generational aspect
the healing
of
my generational trauma, if I intend it as such, if I do it only in my own local world, then it has some effect. But if I intend my healing of trauma for the evolution of consciousness, then I'm being an evolutionary by that act. And as I transform trauma from separate self-psychological work into evolutionary work, I'm an erotic mystic reweaving the field of eros. Well, then my trauma work's completely different. And then my trauma work has much more capacity to be successful. Because trauma work today is about organizing the memory of the past. But there's not just the memory of the past. There's the depth of the present, and there's the memory of the future. So trauma work has basically dissociated from the eternal depth of enlightenment in the present and from the call of the memory of the future. So if I could kind of frame it for a second, we live in a psychological self. And the psychological self says that one quality of time dominates the past. Now, that's not wrong. Breuer's sitting there with Freud in Vienna, and you've got all these hysterical women, right, that are being labeled as hysterical, somehow almost evil women. And Breuer says, fuck you, culture. Actually, these women were abused, right? And we actually need to hold them with compassion, and they're actually victims. And we actually need to go into their past, find the key to unlock the gate to their beauty and their depth. That's gorgeous, right? So psychology locates this, there's this great wisdom in the past. We need to go back and we weren't aware of that before. That was one of the greatest evolutions of consciousness in Western civilization, is that realization of psychology that we can actually reconfigure past patterns by re-entering the past and reliving the past. Stunning.
Wow.
That's stunning.
Yeah.
So that's the psychological self. But then you have a second self, which is equally important, which I call the mystical self. And the mystical self is the self of the great lineages that didn't understand the past, but they did get the depth of the present, the eternity that resides in the moment. So notice this, the psychological self ignores the mystical self. Psychology generally ignores the depth of the transpersonal. The mystical self ignores the psychological self. So the mystical self says, go into the infinite depth of the present, and there you'll find wholeness. That's exactly half true, just like the psychological self is exactly half true. They both ignore and cancel each other, but you can't just get whole. I know a number of people, very, very, very good people who are very close to Muktananda. It was a very important
Muktananda, that's so interesting. You mentioned that particular guy.
And a very important American teacher. But the tragedy of the world around Muktananda, not just him, but the entire world of Eastern spiritual teaching that came to the United States, is it didn't get the importance of the psychological. And it thought that the mystical self would heal everything, just like the psychological self ignored the depth of enlightenment. So there's a psychological self, which says the primary experience of reality is the past. The key to liberation is reliving the past. Mystical self ignores the psychological self. No. The eternity of the now. Those are both important, true but partial. We need to integrate them both, but we need to bring a third self online. I call the third self the evolutionary self. The evolutionary self is called by the memory of the future. The evolutionary self understands that hope is a memory of the future, and transformation is a memory of the future. That's what transformation is. Transformation is, it's 20 years ago. I moved from 25 to 20, just 20 years ago. Let's say 25, right? Luke is in a hard moment, but he has a memory of the future. He sees this other Luke. And he's called,
like a vision of potentiality.
Right. It's a vision of possibility, but it's not just a psychological vision. You're called. You actually feel the call. That future Luke is calling me. There's a future self that's calling me. And that's the unique self of Luke that needs to be recovered. So I don't just recover and reorganize the past, I actually recover the vision of my future. And I can't actually get out of the mud, the crude metaphor, if I'm just pushing from behind. I need to be pulled by the future. So in our model of self, if we can kind of augment, we started with separate self, true self, unique self, evolutionary unique self. That was our 4 puzzle piece model. That's model 1 in this new story of value we call cosmoerotic humanism. Model 2, and they work together, is there's a psychological self, and there's a mystical self, and there's an evolutionary or future self, and we need all 3. One emphasizes the past, the other emphasizes the present, the third emphasizes the future. All 3 of them dismiss the other one. Tragic. We need to integrate them in. I'm called by the future. I live in the depth of the present, and I recover and reorganize the memory of the past. So we need to do that for culture. That's what we need. That's what a new story of value does, right? It actually allows people to live in that story of value. And I have a 12-year-old son who's a gorgeous young man, Zion. And he came to me and said, I want to watch TikTok. And I said, not even a conversation, no. Right? It's not actually, so let's negotiate. No negotiation, right? He said, why? I said, because TikTok is videos that go every 45 seconds, which your mind actually turns off. They actually bypass the process of transmission of values. You get completely addicted to them, and your mind is going to be fried by 15. So you can be as mad at me as you want. I love you madly. No. Right? And that's what we're doing, right? Is we're taking people out of the field of value. TikTok, Facebook, right? The entire social media complex is driven by profit, by a series of private companies. It's actually shocking. Private companies that are now controlling our shared space. And Metcalfe's law, right? We have no choice but to be in that shared space, because if we're not in that shared space, we're cut off from social discourse. Right? So I've got to be somehow connected. And in that shared space, they're actually optimizing for engagement, which means addiction, meaning most time on an app, which directly generates more what's called digital exhaust, right? More breadcrumbs, which are then fed into algorithmic structures, which then create predictive analysis about what my future behavior will be. And then that predictive analysis is sold in Chinese auctions happening billions of times a day to misaligned third parties who are misaligned with my highest value. That's a shocking reality, and no one's ever agreed to it. And the reason it started was because, in 2001, Google was having a hard time, and Sergey and Larry were living in, Silicon Valley. And as Sergey said, he said, I don't want to be a schmuck and just have a $40 million company. And so they then reconfigured their business model against their own internal sense of values, right, which was that a search engine couldn't do advertisement. And they figured out how to actually do advertisement much more effectively through this reality mining, turning digital exhaust into predictive analysis. 2002, 2003, Eric Schmidt, kind of works on that very intensely. And the reason they get away with it is because, in their own internal senses, it wasn't against the law. It wasn't against the law because the law had become dissociated from value. And law didn't even know how to address it because it was an emergent reality that law couldn't address. So basically, Sergey and Larry are basically postmodernists, dissociated from the field of value at their very core. So is Mark. Mark went to Exeter, Zuckerberg, right? Exeter is a place I've taught, given public assemblies, met with hundreds of students. Exeter is utterly dissociated from the field of value. I spoke to one teacher at Exeter who said to me, when I came to Exeter, right, the good, the true, and the beautiful were a given for everybody. 40 years later, I leave Exeter. Neither the students nor the faculty, right, actually subscribes to any field of value, to any good, true, and beautiful. That's what educated Mark Zuckerberg. So he goes to Facebook and he basically says he's trying to figure out, okay, how do we actually organize and control reality and actually organize love based on algorithmic structures that are measurable? Because for him, there's no field of value. And these companies, right, and of course, Beidou, right, in China, it's all over the world. They've taken over the social space. They've actually created our social space. They're unregulated by government because government actually doesn't have any data engineers, data scientists who know how to regulate it to understand the algorithms. So there's no binding force, right? It's a shocking reality. So we get upgraded algorithms, very narrow vectors of profit for, 15 or 20 people. It's actually shocking, right? That are actually controlling, right, the space of consciousness world over based on appealing to the lowest common denominator, which can affect control, and they're actually rooted in Skinner. And Skinner writes a novel in 1948 called Walden 2, which is far more frightening than the novel the year before by Orwell, 1984. Right?
But
right?
not meant to be.
But not meant to be. And Walden 2 is a description of a city driven and organized by what are called controllers, right, who organize the space and operate the levers of control without anyone in the city knowing it's possible. And then Skinner writes afterwards, he says, Walden 2 is the only way to respond to existential risk. He doesn't use those words, but it's what he implies. He says, the problem is I don't have the instruments and the methods to accomplish it. Along comes data science and provides the Skinnerian reductive materialist worldview with instruments and methods. MIT Media Lab steps in front and center doing data science. And we have this new reality driven by algorithmic structures, listen to this, that no one voted on. So you think you live in a democracy. Well, do we? No one voted on any of these things. Who voted? These are the most important issues at stake.
Not only did people not vote for
no one's
them,
even aware they were happening.
They don't know they exist.
They don't even know they exist, right? Right? No vote. And now as we're moving into kind of chat GPT-4, right? These new, right, AI structures, in which the entire AI race, right, is driven by a very small group of people. And you've got about 20% of leading AI people today who think that AI, right, is existential risk, meaning it can actually cause for, it's a different podcast, right? For a number of reasons, it can cause a values lock-in because once we get to AGI, general artificial intelligence, then within a year or two, whoever gets to AGI first essentially dominates all militaries and all economies. So let's say that happens to China. You get a China values lock-in for 1,000 years. I mean, it's a very serious issue. So why are we doing it? Why do we keep developing towards artificial general intelligence? If there's a 20% risk, that's going to cause existential risk, right? Either an extinction, because we don't know what it's going to do. We don't know. It's a black box. It's what Nick Bostrom calls in a 2019 essay called the vulnerability hypothesis. It's a black box where you don't know what it's going to produce. Why don't we stop? Because we're out of the field of value. And so the only thing in the field is a pseudo-eros story called win-lose metrics. So therefore, we create this world of multipolar traps and races to the bottom, tragedies of the commons, where essentially everyone keeps developing it because no one knows how to get off the wheel because there's this addiction. And this is literally happening today. As ChatGPT-4, and all of a sudden people are saying, oh, this is a little scary, but the development goes on. There's been in the last 4 months an explosion of reinvestment by a series of companies in new AI technologies because one company was successful with ChatGPT-3, which that blew Google out of the water. Google was like shocked. They then took off the shelves all of their development, ignored all the ethical concerns, even though they pretended to pay attention to them. And we literally have an AI arms race because we're out of the field of value. So in other words, we can't just deal with individual trauma, right? We have to deal with the collective trauma of being outside the field of value. And then, Fromm wrote a book, Eric Fromm, who's gorgeous, called The Sane Society. And his basic point was, you think you're insane, and you think it's your personal insanity. Actually, it might be a collective pathology. And there's no great accomplishment, right, to be well-adjusted in an insane society. Right? That's right. If you're well-adjusted in an insane society, there's something wrong with you. We should actually be outraged. We should experience the maladjustment. And it's only that emergence of will, political will, and political will only emerges from a field of value. It's only if you feel values being violated that you're outraged. So when people look at the Webplex today, why aren't they outraged? Because basically people aren't in the field of value. So they can't figure out, well, what's been violated? It's not against the law. What's been violated is human personhood. Right? I mean, Skinner and Pentland at the MIT Media Lab take it as a given there's no human choice. Choice is an illusion. That's shocking. Atlantic Magazine, 2016, cover article, choice is an illusion. Personhood's an illusion. Right? But if I don't believe that personhood's an intrinsic value of cosmos, if I don't believe choice is an intrinsic value of cosmos, if I don't believe transformation is an intrinsic value of cosmos, well, it's not against the law. Nothing's been violated. There's no outrage. That's why outrage is so important. Right? Because we don't even know what's been violated. And that's what that movie Network he was saying is like, this is wrong, right? Like, get mad. I'm not going to take this anymore. So we need to invoke outrage. We can only invoke outrage when we're in the field of value. Otherwise, we get lost in the rabbit hole of our personal traumas. And it's why I responded to your question in this particular way, right? Personal trauma is critical, but can also become a form of pseudo-eros. It can also become the rabbit hole I go down to actually ignore, right, the larger collapse of the field of value, to ignore existential risk, to ignore the larger vectors of the story because I'm not even sure what to do with it. So I just kind of look away. Robert K. Lifton wrote a book called Facing Apocalypse, where he talks about the deep desire to look away. We've got to look towards. And so that's a big conversation.
There's something
like that.
really interesting that came to mind when you're describing the capacity we have to work on the past and to focus on the past, and that's what shaped us, our traumas, right? And digging in the past and the whole Freudian piece, right? And then you have the Muktananda presence,
right?
The eternal now, and then
right.
you have the
mystical self.
You have the mystical self, then you have the vision of the future self. And it was interesting as you described that, because at different times, I think I've touched elements of that along my own personal evolution.
Right.
However, and I always give this disclaimer, I'm not saying this is the way for everyone, but as you're saying that, my awareness is screaming psychedelics, because those experiences are where, for me personally, my story, not for everyone, do your research, do your own thing, people. But that is where all of the pieces of psychology, mysticism, all
Right.
of those constructs, all the versions of me, almost like a Russian doll. That's a
Yes.
vision that's come
Beautiful.
to me, is like doing inner
A
child work, for
nested Russian
example. I
doll.
can sit with the therapist and I go, oh shit, man, when I was 5, this happened. Well, now I see why I'm this way. And I might get some incremental change and evolution out of
That's
that.
valuable.
But I still saw, well, that was Luke, the little boy who doesn't
Right.
exist anymore.
Right.
He's gone. Now I'm this different person as an adult. And through
Beautiful.
these processes, I've seen the Russian doll. It's like, no, every version of myself from my
Gorgeous.
inception until this moment is actually still me, and I'm still here. It's an integration process.
That's great.
And in some of those experiences, I mean, to call it like a deep, reverent presence, there's no words that can even describe the
Right.
level of presence in the me now, and the integration of the past traumatized me and the psychological sort of model that was necessary to heal those parts of myself within me in the now. But more than anything is like, okay, so I'm that and I'm this.
Right.
But what if I was that future
Right.
self, right?
Right.
The evolutionary,
Calling me.
mystical self is going like, oh, we're pulling you toward what you could be.
Gorgeous.
But we have to pull you with what you were and what you are,
That's right.
because it's all present in the eternal now.
Right. No, that's
Right?
gorgeous, right?
And I'm sure many people, I think you've said
Gorgeous.
different paths to the same mountain or something.
One mountain, many paths.
One mountain,
right.
many paths. I love that. I've never heard it said like that, but this has just been my path. It's like,
Gorgeous.
25 years of working in all the realms,
Yeah.
and then the past few years of integrating that with the assistance of ceremony and whatnot, right? And in those,
That's
I mean,
so Luke,
those have been the exponential movers for me, where it's like, whoa, go spend a weekend somewhere, kind of unpack all this, put it together without without being encumbered by the mind and the ego and all the things, and being in more of a state of pure consciousness, and having
beautiful.
having the veil of my senses sort of out of the way, and everything is more clear.
Clear.
Clarity on putting that all together in a comprehensive way and emerging as a different person.
Beautiful.
Not just feeling different, but
Actually,
my whole life actually becoming different. Relationships, work,
everything.
mission, purpose, my value, my field of value, expanding and growing and becoming more inclusive of totality.
Gorgeous. So
And
psychedelics.
yeah, so psychedelics.
Psychedelics, great. It's great. So
I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, like, when I heard you talk about those sort of 3 different aspects of us, I'm like, and the answer is that. It's like,
so psychedelic.
can they take us there collectively?
Psychedelics actually, let's say 3 things. 1, psychedelics are enormously important. They're enormously important in addressing trauma, both personally and collectively. So my core understanding, which is central to this new story of value of cosmorotic humanism, is that part of enacting a world religion is the ritual of psychedelics. Psychedelics is a critical ritual that actually gives people direct access to real states of consciousness. And like anything can be misused, right? Anything can be misused, but fundamentally, psychedelics are a monumental breakthrough to open up democratizations of enlightenment. They don't replace practice, but they open up what the interior sciences call itaruta de la ela, arousal from above. Isn't that beautiful?
Nice.
So arousal from above is you fall in love.
Got that right.
Right? Got that right, right? Got that one right, right?
Yeah.
Right? So you fall in love, arousal from above. Then it's, it's a year later and there's conflict and there's separation and there's power struggle and there's, re-individuating, right? And that's fine. But you need the original falling in love to actually feel the possibility, and that becomes your North Star. If you skip falling in love, and there's an enormous literature in the love relationship literature that says, oh, love begins when you fall out of love and you start to do the work. Bullshit, right? Love begins when you fall in love, right? And that's a structure of cosmos, which is arousal from above. You then lose access to that arousal from above. Station 1 of love is falling in love. Station 2 of love is you lose access to that. In the interior sciences, we call station 1 hachna'a, submission, right? You fall in love. Where do we want to live? Alaska? Sure, let's move to Alaska, right? So it's complete arousal from above. Second stage, separation, individuation, the power struggle. And then third stage, you actually follow the North Star of that original arousal from above, and you fall in love again at a higher level of consciousness. So psychedelics are the experience of falling in love with reality, and reality falling in love with you. It's a gift. It's an arousal from above. Now, you don't then retain it. You don't live in psychedelics, but you now have a vision of what's possible. Now, you need to ground that vision. And here I want to say a key sentence. And, I did a journey with a dear friend that's joined me in Holy of Holies, actually a mutual friend of ours, Aubrey. He joined me in what I call Holy of Holies, which is a place of study, a kind of transmission of the Dharma. And so we study a lot these days. And so we're doing what I call the Dharma. The Dharma is the new story of value. Right? And then we actually sat and did a journey together, a journey into medicine, into ceremony. And as I came out of the journey, I turned to Aubrey and I said, the medicine needs the Dharma and the Dharma needs the medicine, right? In other words, medicine without Dharma is actually problematic. Just like state experiences can be interpreted in all sorts of ways. And Nazis had very intense state experiences and used psychedelics and used occult, right? So as occult can be misused all the time and psychedelics can be misused. And there was a reason why the conventional world was wary of psychedelics. It wasn't just crazy people. There's reason to be wary. So psychedelics or medicine without Dharma, problematic. But Dharma needs ritual, needs practice, needs medicine. And so I think one of the essential structures of a new world religion, again, not a dominating world religion, a world religion as a context for our diversity, as the context for 1,000 religions, right? But this or better way to say it is world religion or a shared field of value, right? A universal grammar of value as a context for our diversity to address the meta crisis has to be informed by medicine and Dharma. And Dharma informs medicine, and medicine informs Dharma. And without having direct access to waking up, and waking up basically means psychedelics, means medicine, means practice. There's different roads. But if I can't actually wake up and have a direct experience that I am the cosmoerotic universe in person, and it's breathing and living me, and the goodness of reality becomes self-evident, and I know that every place I fall into the hands of she, and I know that beauty is real and truth is real and goodness is real and it all matters, right? And that it's all living and alive and it all wants me to transform and wants my success, and that all of reality is actually cheering me on, that I was intended by reality. I'm not an accident. I'm desired by reality. I'm chosen by reality. I'm recognized by reality. I'm needed by reality. If I can't have that a direct first-person experience of that, the whole thing fails. I mean, all of these are just words until we live them in the stories of our lives. So beautiful psychedelics is an absolute necessity. And of course, in the intimate universe, nothing happens without deep synchronicity. So the fact that psychedelics have been developed chemically in the last 40, 50 years, and they're coming online together with plants. So you've got both a kind of a pharmacological, but quite sophisticated, right? Let's not dismiss MDMA, right? In other words, you have a quite sophisticated, right? Let's not dismiss LSD. These are sophisticated, subtle, often misused. But when used properly, at the Masters and Johnson Clinic, one of the people on our board, a wonderful person, they were the clinical directors there. They used MDMA, right? Or we're using MDMA is wildly important. So if we can actually bring the plant online and the sacred technologies of pharmacology and have those become part of a deep world spirituality ritual, which itself is mediated through Dharma. So meaning, just an example, it doesn't get hijacked by like, okay, I have a psychedelic experience and I'm completely egocentric, so I'm God. Dangerous. I have a psychedelic experience, I'm totally ethnocentric. My people are the chosen people and no one else is. So in other words, psychedelics is always mediated through a prism of interpretation. So the Dharma needs the medicine needs Dharma. And that becomes the cornerstone of healing the trauma of culture itself. How insanely exciting and how insanely promising. And so it's not just we're before dystopia. As we kind of come to the end of our conversation, we're talking about existential risk, and we're talking about this potential dystopia, but we're also invoking here together, which is so exciting, is we're not just poised before dystopia. That's a mistake. We're actually in a time between worlds. We're in a time between stories. We're poised between utopia and dystopia.
Yeah.
We can create the most beautiful world imaginable, and we need the technologies to do it, and we can do it. And we're not waiting for the savior to do it, right? We are the savior. She lives in us. And obviously your podcast and your intention is part of the fabric of that field. So what a crazy delight.
It's beautiful. Yeah,
Right?
it's such an exciting and interesting time to be alive.
Oh my God.
You know, like for me, if I let go of my attachment to how I think things should be and understand that the way things are is largely based on my perception of what they are and what I think and feel about it. But if I can be as objective as I can possibly be, you see the dystopia just growing like this fucking monster, you know, with all of the things you talked about, these elements of control, the empire, the state,
Right.
the AI, and you just think, oh my God, I just want to hide in the closet. Yet at the very same time, there's masses of people waking up like I've never seen in my short 52 years. I mean, speaking of social media, I mean, I don't use TikTok, but Allison does, and she'll send me just weird, I don't know, just
right.
spacey shit, you know, just look at this weird post, you know, and I'll look at that and it'll be some young person in their 20s who's, I mean, even things just like what's in Antarctica and why aren't we allowed to know? You know, this is like a 22-year-old and the meaning of Earth. I mean, just the meaning of everything, right? You have people that are at least questioning now, and many people are kind of getting sidetracked on all sorts of weird shit that's not actually going to affect change. But the point is, the minds are opening, and the legislation, you know, toward psychedelics used intentionally, and all of the positive things that are happening. Just people are really into spirituality. I remember when I started on this path, when the book "The Power of Now" came out, it was just like, I mean, I guess it became a popular book, but I remember first reading that and going like, what? You're not your mind? You know, that was a novel idea to me. There's this other thing, the pain body and the ego, and it put so many pieces together. And now when I hear people talk, you know, speaking of social media, it's like everyone just understands that now. And young people too.
Yeah.
It's not just the spiritual seekers going to Esalen and the Omega Institute.
Absolutely.
Right? It used to be like, well, there's this small subsect, a microculture of spiritual seekers. They were kind of the new agey types or the personal development, more mainstream types with the est and all that. Now you just have like regular people going, there's got to be more. And they're reaching out and they're expanding. And so as dark as things are getting, on the other side of the scale, it's like, holy shit.
And we got to hold that
We're stoked.
Hope. We're stoked, and we got to look high. If we look low, we go low.
That's something I need to get better at, because
we got to look right.
There's a part of me that like, I want to know the whole scope of what's happening, right? I want to see the whole playing field. But there's something instinctual in me that's like, let's look at all the dark shit. You know
and we can't look away from that. You're right. In other words, dystopia is real.
But there's kind of an addictive quality to it.
And there's an addictive quality to it. And so we need to kind of look really clearly and not look away at the genuine existential risks and there's sets of bad actors, and those are real, and we won't defeat that. And yes, there is a battle here. But it's not a battle which is a kind of propaganda battle, right? It's actually a standing for possibility. If we don't actually see the dream, and more than even seeing the dream, we have to live the dream. In other words, if we wait to live the dream when it's all perfect, so we're kind of being activists, and we become very bitter. We defer the dream. Remember Langston Hughes, the black poet. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, and then at the end of the poem explode? So you can only change the world if you're willing to already live in the world that's already changed. So I've got to be the utopia, but not utopia in the kind of 20th century, you know, hijacked, you know, Walden 2 way, but actually a genuine, healthy, whole, gorgeous utopia. I've got to live the dream. I got to be homo amor. That's our language for it in cosmologic universalism. I've got to be the new human. I've got to make love, right? I've got to be an activist. I've got to just be wildly excited about my food, right? I've got to be wildly excited about feeding the next person. I've got to be just blown away by creating my home and the spaciousness of my. I've got to live the dream, because if I don't live the dream, I don't know what the dream is. And I can't, in the interior sciences, Sabbath, every 7 days, Sabbath is 24 hours, was the technology of living the dream. And no matter where you were, what was going on, or what the brutality was, or what the specter of risk was, Sabbath, you step into the dream. You step into the future world. So we have to, there's this kind of doomer mentality that's kind of pervading, so much of the conversation. No, that's a huge mistake, right? We've got to live the dream and face dystopia at the same time. We can only do that if we step into the field of value. And so all of these hopeful signs you point to are absolutely true, and they will dissipate. They won't coalesce. They won't become imaginal cells that generate a butterfly unless we articulate a new story of value that they can live in and articulate a new field of value. So that seems to be that's the overwhelming moral imperative. And in this podcast, we're excited to participate in that together. So
Very
there's
much
enormous.
so.
We get to be excited.
Yeah, very much
We're
so.
not naive. It's not naive excitement. Right? We get to be excited. We get to
Right.
be evangelical even.
It's not the spiritual bypassing love and light.
Right.
And
that's
it's
right.
also not the doom scrolling.
It's not the doom
We're
scrolling.
fucked either way. Why bother? And just go into
Right.
apathy and
Right.
selfishness.
That's right. But it is, if we can claim that word, it's evangelical. But evangelical, when I took 3 years off at some point in my life, different conversation, different story, to actually feel like what would life look like, not as a cultural critic, world philosopher dude, get a real job. So I got a real job for 3 years.
What were you doing?
Right. I was actually working in the entrepreneurial world and involved in kind of companies. And so for 3 years, it was like age 30 to 33, I would visit Infinity Loop in Cupertino a lot, which was Apple, and different conversation. But so there were they were called Apple evangelists. That was the name in the company. And evangelists, as you and I both know, it's the good news. They were sharing, and they were just so excited about Apple. And I, of course, didn't quite understand the technology. So whenever all of it, I'd get into a conversation, I would just nod, like excited. So I was the most popular guy because I would listen to all the techies telling their stories. But they were beautiful people, like wildly excited about techno-utopian possibilities. They were wrong about the details, but they were evangelical, which was very beautiful. Right? And so we need to be evangelical, meaning we can't be embarrassed by the thought that there's good news. That's what evangelist is. There's good news. So we're not doomers. We're not Pollyannish, right? We're not avoiding apocalypse, but we're actually evangelical. You can be a public intellectual and extremely rigorous and a philosopher and be filled with an evangelical fervor, which is the good news that human beings are beautiful. And there's a field of value we live in, and the Tao is real, right? And there's suffering, but suffering actually tells us that goodness is real. And actually, the story is going someplace, and telos is real, and there's a plot line to the story, and we're part of it. And my story is part of it, and that's gorgeous. And we need to tell that to our kids, like that.
Amen, brother.
Amen, brother.
Thank you for telling our podcast listeners today.
Yeah, thank you for having me in your home and in your beautiful space. It's been a delight.
Fun. I love this, dude. I could do this forever.
Crazy delight.
We're definitely going to have to do it again.
Amen.
I know it's a good one, and I've said this many times on the show. Like, I always have my kind of manuscript.
Right.
Partly just so when you leave, I'm not like, but I didn't. Right. I don't like the sense of regret that comes with having a really important question, but it's really fun when I just forget about that. Then I know we're in some deep water and moving through in a different realm. So thank you so much. Before we go,
please.
I was refreshing myself on your website, and I mean, you have a lot of content, a lot of books, you have courses. What are you most excited about right now if people were intrigued by your perspective and want more of you?
I'd say if I invite people to read one thing or two things, I'd say there's a book called Your Unique Self, which is on Amazon, and a book I wrote with my beloved partner and deep partner in Muse, right? Dr. Christina Kincaid, called A Return to Eros. So if you want a way into
I just got that Audible. Because I wanted to talk to you today, by the way, about just sex and love and relationships.
Well, let's do another one on that.
Yeah, but then I realized, I want to read the book, or at least listen to the book.
Right.
I'm not that good at reading because of social media frying my brain, but I can listen well.
Yeah.
But yeah, so
our friend Gabriel Anwar actually is a wonderful person. beautiful actress actually did this. She read it
I started listening
in
to
this
it.
great British accent.
Yeah, it's
Right, I know, right?
wonderful. Yeah, I got a few minutes into it and I realized, oh no, I need to finish this and then we'll have a conversation about
So those
that.
2 books,
Okay.
we run once a year in Europe, actually, a mystery school, which we've been doing for the last decade, which is a deep dive intensive. So we'll send you a link to that.
Oh, cool.
And every week we run, you mentioned it, we do this thing called One Mountain, Many Paths, which is a kind of weekly kind of online, it's not really a podcast, it's more of a kind of coming together in community and telling the new story of value. And every week we try and work out another piece of the Dharma as a kind of revolutionary, evolutionary act.
Awesome. Is that like a group Zoom kind of thing?
It's a group Zoom kind
Oh,
of
cool.
thing, right? My kind of partner in crime in a lot of this is a person that's also studied with me, as a student and became a very close friend and interlocutor, Dr. Zach Stein, who's the co-president of the center, who's a key partner in cosmologic humanism. And of course, Christina Kincaid and John Mackey's been involved, and my friend Ken Wilber and Sally Kempton. And so there's Daniel Schmachtenberger. There's a field of deep students, friends, partners, interlocutors, because we never move down the field ourselves. And so I just want to honor, Lori Galperin. There's a whole gang. There's a few dozen people at the center of the think tank. And the think tank is maybe the last sentence. The think tank is really it's a cover, right? There's a deeper conspiracy, and the conspiracy is really just a band of unimaginably good human beings, who are all outrageous lovers, just depth and grounded. And so I could not be more honored to be surrounded by just such, unimaginably good people. And actually Aubrey, our friend, is coming on board as the chair of the think tank. So he's
cool.
He's stepping in. And so
Awesome.
welcome.
Awesome.
I look forward to, Luke, this was just, to permit me a compliment. You were just a joy to talk to.
Oh, thank you so
Just
much.
a joy to talk to, both the
Thank you.
questions and just but more just your space. Just being in your spaces was a great joy.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah. I wonder if there's you've probably teased this out, but I wonder if there's a more appropriate term than think tank.
Yeah.
Like it's not feel tank, because you're not just I feel,
It's not action tank.
There's thinking involved, and I've not been there, but just the way you describe kind of what you're doing in these partnerships, it's there's some other.
It's a band of outrageous lovers.
There's a something tank,
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Because I know you guys are doing more than thinking. You're being, you're feeling, you're thinking, you're creating.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the truth is that we use the word think tank because of it does also function as a think tank, but there's really no word for it. Right? There's a gentleman named Philip Wexler who wrote a book called, Spiritual Societies. And what does it mean? You're in the Renaissance, you're in Florence, right? And, Paul Tillich, who's a theologian, but also is a little bit of a cultural historian, points out that there were, Luke, not more than 1,000 people in the Renaissance who were really players in the Renaissance. You think it was not a broad movement.
Oh, really?
It's about 1,000 people, really major players.
Wow.
And everyone else is just getting drunk in Florence and doing what you do in Florence, right? So, and the Medicis, of course, enacted it. So what does it mean, when there's a kind of evolutionary community? We don't quite have a word for it. It's not a church.
It's not a cult. There's no charismatic leader.
There's right, and it's the center of the movement is not the teacher; it's the Dharma itself.
Right.
It's very beautiful.
Yeah.
Right. In the Ark and the Hebrew wisdom tradition. In the Ark, you don't have the rabbi, you have the scrolls, right? In other words, at the center is not the charismatic teacher, it's the charismatic Dharma. And it's like a karate dojo. So anyone in our system, for example, wants to challenge me, and if you're right, gorgeous, let's evolve the Dharma. So it's very, very beautiful in that way. But you're right. I love your inquiry that ends us, which is we don't quite have a word for it. It's the Teilhard de Chardin, the evolutionary paleontologist who was important in evolutionary theory, talks about the almost sensual yearning for the communion of evolutionary activists, right? Our desire to actually be in this field of communion. We find each other. So we found each other. We're allured to each other. And so it's an evolutionary community, right? It's a think tank. It's a spiritual community. It's a cultural critic community. But it's none of those. It's more than all of those. So I love your pointing to the fact that we haven't worded it yet. Yeah, and it's still in that ineffable and in that beauty.
Yeah. Well,
Yay.
sometimes the best things are ineffable, and you just
Right?
kind of have to throw a label
Right.
on it so it gives people some
Right.
semblance of an idea of what they can expect, you know?
That's right, right. I mean, you can't actually fund a band of outrageous lovers.
Yeah.
It's harder, right? So, right,
Totally.
and we need to resource it, right?
Totally.
So,
I'd probably invest.
yeah, there we
Send me
are.
the deck.
Send me the deck.
All right,
Oh
you
my
guys,
God.
we're going to put everything that Mark just talked about at lukestory.com/Gafni. That's Gafni. So we'll put links to all of the things that he just mentioned
Thank you.
and anything else we can find to put in there. I know you named so many relevant historical figures, most of which I've never heard of, but I
Yeah.
trust that they're important because of what you've derived from their perspectives. But we're going to fill the
Oh,
show notes with a bunch of goodies.
that's awesome. And to have 10 seconds?
Take all the time you want.
In the public culture, you always deal with kind of public culture, which mediates facts through a kind of strange social media broken prism. So I've actually had the quite painful privilege of being also attacked and falsely attacked. And I'm sure some of the listeners that whenever I do a podcast, there's always some people who kind of encounter that. So I would actually, I did a wonderful podcast, which actually our friend Aubrey initiated with Christina, Dr. Kincaid, and myself. And maybe we'll put that up there also. So if
Absolutely.
anyone's interested in kind of like,
Yeah.
right? So if kind of, friends, Romans, and countrymen, if you run into kind of online controversy, you want to get a sense of it, first, if anyone's always invited to call me directly, right? Two is there's an entire website called Who is Marc Gafni, which just kind of refutes just the objective kind of false constructions on the internet. But my partner KK is far more beautiful and subtle and wise and eloquent. And her and Aubrey talk really beautifully in this podcast. Maybe we'll post that there for anyone
Absolutely.
who's interested.
Absolutely.
Yay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
For that. And it's unfortunate that you've had to bear that cross as well.
What a delight.
Dramatic, but
Right.
yeah. I mean, who is without controversy?
Yeah, it's painful.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Well, thanks, dude.
thank you, man.
Great dropping in with you. I can't wait to do this again.
Madly, it was really great. Thank you.
Right on.
Yay.